University of the West Indies, Mona. The Caribbean Center for Educational Planning was established with a mandate of providing thought leadership and capacity building in the area of educational policy and planning in order to support regional development in the Caribbean. Today's webinar, being held under the theme Learning from the COVID-19 Pandemic, Imperatives and Opportunities for Building Resilient Education Systems, while representing a specific response to the 6-month-old phenomenon called the coronavirus, is more focused on the strategic issue of sustainable educational planning, the mandate of the CCEP. I welcome everyone, especially our attendees who have joined us online, and at last check, we were heading beyond 70 participants. We anticipate that before my opening comments are over, we would have exceeded 100. We have what I hope you'll find to be an insightful and informative 2 hours planned. Among the persons who have been committed, who have joined us to enable us to deliver that package of meaningful and insightful information, to whom I extend a very, very special welcome, are the principal of the Mona campus, Pro-Vice Chancellor, Professor Dale Weber, Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Education, Jamaica, Dr. Grace McLean, Lead Specialist, Social Sector Department, Education Division, Inter-American Development Bank, Ms. Cynthia Hobbs, who will be our keynote speaker, Program Specialist for Education at UNESCO Caribbean Office, Dr. Farrell Khan, Registrar and Chief Executive Officer of the Caribbean Examinations Council, Dr. Wayne Wesley, and countless other, well, not quite countless, several other educational organization and developmental support entities represented, all of whom will be introduced more specifically later. We also have here, to whom I extend great thanks, members of the CCEP operations team. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought a strain on every sector of human society, and the Caribbean, as a vulnerable region, is likely to be reeling from its effects for a long time to come. Regions such as ours are vulnerable to shocks, and prior to COVID-19, there were issues placing strain on and posing challenges for our education system. COVID-19 has simply placed a greater strain on these systems. It is our hope that coming out of this webinar, there will be ideas and insights to respond to and arise from the challenges posed by the pandemic. But we also hope that in responding to these challenges, we will be positioning our education system to combat other challenges which may be on the horizon. With that, I wish to hand over to Professor Weber, who will bring his opening remarks, after which we'll hear from Dr. Farrell Khan.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. Dr. Thompson, head of the CCEP, Dr. Farrell Khan, Mr. Cynthia Hobbs, Permanent Secretary Dr. McLean, the wide range of ably talented cadre of persons I've seen in both panel 1 and panel 2 for today's webinar, and the moderators, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to you all. I'm pleased to have been asked to bring greetings on behalf of the University of the West Indies Mona campus. The importance of planning and evaluation in providing our students with a quality learning experience can never be understated. And this webinar is going to be a door-opening exercise as we contemplate where we are and where we want to go. The passion that we have for sharing knowledge must be appropriately channeled if we are to adequately serve our students and our region. Planning and evaluation enables us to critically assess where we're coming from so that we can articulate the linkages and where we want to go. This webinar, like many other fora put on today by the Caribbean Center for Educational Planning, affords us an occasion to examine our unique circumstances and collectively focus on our solutions. Today, we have an opportunity to contemplate our circumstances in light of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 has altered life as we know it, has altered educators across the region, and we have all gone to previously unimaginable lengths to now continue engaging students teaching and learning. Amidst the reports of challenges that have touched us, we also have amazing stories of adaptation, evolution within our education system. This is a mark of resilience. The mission of education sector today is to continue the transformation in the midst of many unique changes wrought by this pandemic. We must seek to transform how we teach, what we teach, and where we teach, so that students can fully be prepared and can operate in this digitized society. I remember when the Mona campus suspended classes, it took us 4 weeks to get our faculty and students in a place where we could continue that delivery. Even as an educator, I recognize that there is a big difference between online teaching and learning and emergency remote teaching and learning, and we strive to close the gap. We thank entities that have worked with us to help us in that exercise, and I wish this webinar was available when we were making the transition, but nothing before its time. This pandemic has highlighted severe gaps in our education system, and if we are to truly recover from this pandemic, and we will, we must move to close these gaps. I'm therefore very confident that this webinar will put us in a place where we can share our stories, we can share our experiences, our challenges, our successes, and how we have done various bits of overcoming so that we can rise to the challenge. It is only through collaborating that we'll be strong enough to be able to overcome and look forward to the next pandemic. I wish to commend the center, the team led by Dr. Thompson, which has worked to put this webinar together. I would like to thank all the presenters, all the moderators, the panelists. Many of them are friends I have not seen in a long time, but I will wait to see what they look like now. People like Chris I haven't seen in ages, and Wayne, who I saw just last month. But I'd love to hear their views on some of what we're going to discuss. This event will go a long way in ensuring that we continue to be educators and educators on the move, resilient to change. I thank you and look forward to a fantastic webinar experience. Good morning.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Principal of the Mona campus, Pro Vice Chancellor, Professor Dale Weber, Dr. Keynote Thompson, Head of the Caribbean Center for Educational Planning, Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Education, Jamaica, Dr. Grace McLean, distinguished panelists and participants, and members of the CCEP operations team. Good morning to all of you. UNESCO has a long-standing partnership with the Caribbean Center, and we are honored to be part of this timely initiative today. COVID-19 pandemic is putting education progress at risk globally through two major shocks. First, the near universal closing of schools at all levels, which could lead to learning loss, increased dropouts, and higher inequality. And secondly, the potential economic recession sparked by the pandemic control measures. The combined impact of school closures and economic hardship could push millions of vulnerable children out of education and reverse decades of hard-won gains. About 1.7 million learners and over 91,000 teachers are affected by the health pandemic in the cluster of the Caribbean member states and associated member states. Countries in the Caribbean have responded with tremendous agility to establish more resilient education systems. There are concerted efforts to reopen schools, strengthen capacity for distance learning to prepare for future COVID outbreaks or other emergencies, and training teachers in remote teaching and learning methods, including for learners with disabilities and in technical and vocational education. It is important to acknowledge that the current crisis will have long-lasting consequences for education systems in terms of access, quality, equity, and management, which are likely to persist beyond the pandemic. So what are some important questions we should be asking today? What are the implications of this crisis for educational planning? How can we channelize this unprecedented mobilization of energy, creativity, and innovation to bring about lasting change in education? How can we reimagine education and build back resilient education systems? Risks of disasters, conflict, and violence are becoming more frequent, pointing towards increased need to strengthen risk reduction capacities in the education sectors, including through prevention, preparedness, and mitigation activities. UNESCO advocates for rapid response efforts to be underpinned by a mid and longer term multi-risk and sustainability-oriented approach for educational planning. Emergencies and school closures have longer term consequences, especially for the most vulnerable and marginalized, magnifying existing disparities within education systems. So we need to plan with attention to equity. It is essential for us to take into consideration the risks of exacerbating disparities, and there are already lessons from the global COVID-19 crisis. Firstly, we need to tackle the digital divide. It is imperative for us to tackle this digital divide as we move forward. Education planners need to consider issues related to access, teacher preparedness, and school-family communication. The public and private partnerships could help ensure that all students have access to information technology or to radio and television modalities that are relevant in some contexts. Teacher training needs to use digital learning management systems and online learning pedagogy before the crises. It is essential to transition to an online learning modality during a time of crisis. So teachers are finding themselves in uncharted territory. Therefore, we might need a brief live-streamed training session to enable them to cope better with this current situation. Establishing communication lines between teachers and parents before crises and maintaining them as children learn from home is also key to support the most at-risk children. Also, we need to, secondly, plan for inclusive learning solutions. Education authorities must take special care in planning for the diverse needs of all learners during the school closures. This is paramount for students with learning disabilities who may struggle to work autonomously and at a distance. It may be desirable to maintain minimum opportunities for classroom learning with small groups of special needs learners. Educational planning and management are instrumental in the response to the pandemic. UNESCO is leading numerous joint activities, and the UNESCO International Institute of Educational Planning has specific initiatives to COVID-19, including crisis-sensitive educational planning. The response to build resilience in education systems is articulated around four main axes. Firstly, supporting the global community of practice of educational planners and managers through online learning forums. We also need to offer webinars, and we are offering new training courses that recognize the protracted nature of this and other crises. And IIEP, UNESCO, the International Institute of Educational Planning, has initiated some new courses that help education systems build resilience. UNESCO and IIEP are also preparing guidelines and mobilizing resources on different aspects of educational planning and management, and providing technical support to member states in response to the COVID-19 crisis. The UNESCO Kingston office, which covers the Caribbean cluster of 20 countries, is ready to provide rapid remote technical support to countries to build resilient education systems. UNESCO Kingston office works closely in close collaboration with IIEP, UNESCO Institute of Statistics, because data is central to inform decisions to build resilient education systems. And we also work with partners such as CARICOM, the Organization of the Eastern Caribbean States, World Bank, UNICEF, IDB, and others. So thank you very much for this dialogue today and for this opportunity to participate in this learning opportunity. And we hope we will all have an opportunity to go back and strengthen our work in education. Thank you very much.
Good morning, colleagues. Thanks, Dr. Khan. Thank you, Principal. Our keynote speaker for this morning is Ms. Cynthia Hobbs. Ms. Hobbs is a lead educational specialist at the Inter-American Development Bank. She has a deep interest in improving teaching quality. Ms. Hobbs has taught in primary schools, universities, and in courses for adults. In addition, Ms. Hobbs has conducted research on teaching practices, including intercultural bilingual math education. Prior to joining the IDB, Ms. Hobbs worked for 15 years at the World Bank, where she oversaw the preparation and execution of education projects in several areas, including early and pre-primary education, primary and secondary education, youth, and transitions from school to work. Cynthia holds a degree in psychology from Bates College in the USA and a master's degree in international education from Harvard University. Welcome, Ms. Hobbs.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much to the CCEP for inviting me to address this very important topic. I'm just going to share my screen. You all confirm that you see it? Yes, I see that you see it. What I'm to present is very in line with what we've heard from the other speakers. We've been working very closely together with other partners to look for solutions to respond to the pandemic. Education as we know it has changed. The pandemic has generated a health crisis, an economic recession, and a learning crisis. All students from all education levels have been affected. Across the region, some 1.7 million students are out of school. We see fairly equal numbers of boys and girls and more secondary school students affected across the country. And here we see that distance education takes many forms. Since schools have closed, ministries have applied emergency responses using different forms of distance education. Delivery of printed materials, television, online platforms, and one very creative Jamaican teacher who set up a community blackboard to post lessons every day. She also gives tips to parents so they can teach their children at home. Soon you'll be seeing Sesame Street episodes on television in Jamaica and Suriname through a contract that the IDB has signed with Sesame to make those episodes available. Although teachers have shown great commitment and creativity to maintain ties with their students, we know that education systems and teachers were not well prepared for the transition to distance learning, and not all students have remained connected. There are economic and social impacts related to school closures. These losses affect individuals and countries. A recent World Bank study estimated that middle and high income countries like the Caribbean countries will suffer earning losses of between 14 and 16% of GDP. Lost learning is due to temporary disconnection with schools, and the longer they're disconnected, students are disconnected, the more loss of learning occurs. Those affect later job opportunities, which lead to projected losses in lifetime earnings. Students also miss social interactions with peers and teachers at school, and school closures affect health and social well-being, especially for poor students who rely on school feeding and school health programs. There are inequities in the education system and differences in academic achievement between children from wealthy families and poor families, and between girls and boys. And these student achievement gaps were already wide even before the COVID-19 pandemic. In PISA results for Trinidad and Tobago, we see here on the right that the largest percent of low-performing students are from poor families in every subject area: reading, science, and mathematics. And on the left, we have the scores. Students from the wealthiest families scored some 90 points higher than students from the poorest families in all three subjects. The PISA report equates 30 score points with about 1 year of schooling. This means that the poor students are the equivalent of 3 school years behind their wealthy classmates. We've seen that lower performing students tend to come from poorer families, and my colleagues at the IDB have done calculations to show that student achievement in first grade can predict how a student will perform on the grade 6 exam to pass to secondary. High stakes exam, because in most countries it determines where students will go to secondary school, and higher performing students have access to better schools with better resources. We see here that the students who score below the 40th percentile when exiting primary school have almost no chance of obtaining a CSEC certificate. That is 5 passes, including math and English. And we know that students that leave secondary with a CSEC certificate earn 40% more than those who do not obtain that CSEC certificate. So quality education in the early years and early detection of learning challenges are extremely important, because learning gaps are very hard to overcome and can define a child's future. We also see differences by gender. Girls outperformed boys in all 3 countries, Barbados, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago, in both math and English CSEC exams in 2015, and a higher percent of girls, signified with this red dot, obtained their CSEC certificate. It is also notable that in all 3 countries, less than 50% of students achieved the CSEC certificate, which is the minimum requirement to enter university or better paying jobs. So what other factors will affect education post-COVID? The pandemic has caused an economic recession and projected drops in income generation from tourism and other service industries. We see negative growth rates projected for 2020 in all countries except Guyana, and this will mean less budget for social sectors, especially for education, since priority will be given to health and social protection. The IMF actually estimates a 7% reduction in spending for education across Latin America and the Caribbean in the next year. Based on a quick survey done by the IDB, we also see a heavy loss of jobs and business closures across the region, with losses much higher for low-income jobs than high-income jobs. This could indicate a need to diversify. Countries cannot rely solely on tourism and service industries or on single commodity markets such as gold and oil. The world is facing rapid changes in the demand for skills. Even before the pandemic, the fourth industrial revolution, climate change, and increased life expectancy have changed the trend in the demand for skills. COVID-19 will also bring changes in demands for skills, especially digital, socio-emotional, and lifelong skills. There's much less demand now for repetitive activities, a need for creation of new activities that demand new abilities, and lifelong learning skills. The data shows that we are already facing a learning crisis. Post-COVID, we're facing new restrictions and challenges. In this context, how do we move forward? What are the imperatives and opportunities for our education systems? We're transitioning from an emergency response to planning for the future. We now have an opportunity to better organize the education systems by collecting and using data, training teachers, providing better resources to teachers and students, involving families, and finding ways to reach students who have been disconnected. What questions can we ask to help us plan for the future? When and where do we learn? To safely reopen schools, we need to clean them, provide clean drinking water and soap, and set up flexible school schedules to allow for social distancing with smaller groups of students. But due to social distancing, some students will likely be at home at any given moment, which will require a blended learning approach. So how do we promote autonomous learning for students learning from a distance? And how do we engage others like parents to help teach? We have a moral imperative to provide quality education for all students, especially knowing what we do about existing learning gaps and predictive pathways for low-performing students. We also know that learning gaps are widening with school closures since some students have fewer resources for distance learning. How do students best learn? Once we assess the learning gaps compounded by the pandemic, we need to develop strategies to help students catch up, like tutoring and accelerated learning programs. This may mean teaching in a different way. One example that I read about recently is the Teaching at the Right Level program started by Pratham, an NGO in India. This program helps children develop foundational reading and math skills working with groups in grades 3 to 5. They start by testing children in basic skills, group them by learning level rather than age or grade, and teach those basic skills for concentrated periods of time. Retest, and then allow students to move individually through the levels as they progress. This program has been evaluated and has shown a positive impact on children's learning. More than 60 million children have benefited from the program in India and Africa. Similar adaptive learning using digital tools can allow students to move at their own pace. How can we better support students? Many students have felt anxiety during the pandemic for a variety of reasons. Separation from school and their friends, difficulties in connecting to school through distance learning, general anxiety of the unknown, possible death in the family, increases in domestic violence and abuse during quarantine, and loss of the safety that school can provide. All these issues require additional support and counseling services. And how do school leaders engage the community in new ways? Capitalizing on parents' greater involvement in schooling over the last few months. How do they foster teaching of life skills and socio-emotional learning? How do they help their teachers learn new things? School leaders need training in change management to lead the required changes in teaching and learning. Dr. Khan mentioned the importance of digital strategies. How can those strategies and technology help us to build resilient education systems? The first order of business is to bolster the Education Management Information Systems, or EMIS, and ensure that everyone is using them so that policymakers, leaders, and teachers have access to accurate, up-to-date data on everything from school infrastructure to teacher qualifications and assignments to student achievement. What resources do we need for effective learning? Information from the EMIS can be used to make decisions to upgrade schools, expand connectivity, and provide digital devices to teachers. Students and teachers need much more training in the use of online and distance modalities in preparation for more blended teaching. The IDB calculated readiness to use technology in several countries across Latin America and the Caribbean, and both in secondary schools and universities. Only 60% of teachers and instructors were estimated to have the digital tools necessary for distance and online teaching. And having lived these last 3 months with 3 teenagers, I can assure you that some children are much more ready for distance learning than others. How do we know what students have learned? Digital strategies and testing, as well as EMIS data and analysis, can be used to identify students who need additional support and early interventions. What should students learn and how should they be certified? As I mentioned, adaptive learning using digital tools allows students to move at their own pace through the curriculum. And tertiary institutions could explore other types of certification. For example, the private sector is focusing more and more on what people know and accepting digital badges in place of university degrees. As we look to the future, how can we prepare better for uncertainties? We have to consider the possibility of future pandemics or climate disasters that require new school closures and distance learning responses, not to mention new school arrangements right now that will teach some students face-to-face and other students from a distance. With government budget cuts in the forecast, how can we forge different partnerships? For example, providing relevant and pertinent education and training and linking learning to jobs. Lifelong learning skills allow us to adapt and learn new skills for new jobs in a rapidly changing labor market. I just read about youth doing digital tracking of re-entering citizens and tourists. Excuse me. Let me start that again. I just read about youth doing digital tracking of re-entering citizens and tourists to be able to trace new COVID cases in Jamaica. And my son is in a high school aviation program learning to fly drones to deliver packages, carry out surveillance, and so forth. And how do universities leverage their research and knowledge base to contribute to solutions? Several Latin American universities generated masks and developed ventilators in the first months of the pandemic. Researchers can also study issues like the widening learning gaps, how to work with children with disabilities, how to reduce dropouts and retain students with the blended teaching and learning approach. So to wrap up, what do we need to ask ourselves as we look at the imperatives and opportunities for building resilient education systems in the Caribbean? How do we minimize inequities in the system? How do we regain learning losses? Who delivers education? What do we deliver? How do we deliver? Where do we deliver? How do we engage new partners in education? And is there a role for regional partnerships? Thank you very much for this moment to share some ideas with you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Good morning, colleagues. Welcome again. Thank you very much, Ms. Hobbs, for such an informative presentation. From your presentation, realize that we need demands for skills, socio-emotional development, digital skills. So we are here for question and answers, and some of the questions that were raised by participants in the discussion. One of the questions that we have here is, in approach to building resilience, but is hearing me? Okay, the question is asked, learning from COVID-19, how can countries prepare teachers for the future in preparing students to be able to cope and manage this situation? One of the questions that is asked. Dr. Ms. Hobbs, would you like to respond to that question, please? Okay. The question that is asked.
Can you ask me the question again?
Okay.
I was assuming you were moving to the next presentation.
Okay, the question is, how can teachers prepare students for this environment, and in the same breath, provide an inclusive education?
So this is a question that we're all asking because we are not even sure how we are reaching students, how many students we're reaching and how we're reaching them. We're not sure even if they're on screen and watching and going through into online platforms, answering questions, whether they're learning and retaining that information, which is why I mentioned that the first important step is assessment to understand who is learning what, how much they're learning, and who has been disconnected during this time. And as Dr. Khan mentioned, there will be a need for training of teachers to help them learn how to reach students in these different modes. In this emergency response, it has been very one way. Students have been watching programs on television. Students have been doing learning online with online platforms. But there's been very little interaction between students. Just yesterday, we had a meeting with the government of Finland, who has very generously offered to partner with the IDB to offer teacher training in digital methods over the next 3 years to the Caribbean region. And our 6 member countries were involved in that discussion. And so.
Oh, she's frozen. Okay.
It's a question that we're all maybe one step ahead of us, such as Finland.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, there's one last question. I think we only have a chance for one last question. And sure. This one is, what can be done to reduce the gaps that exist in education for rich and poor, boys and girls, based on your data that you've presented? What can be done in the Caribbean to address that?
Well, my answer is always considered a bit radical, but the first thing we can do is make sure that every single secondary school is of high quality. So it doesn't matter which secondary school you place into, whether it's there wouldn't be the high performing schools and the low performing schools. So that a student at a high performing school automatically goes to university, and a student at a low performing school really never has that opportunity. So the first thing would be to equalize the quality of education across the schools, and then use programs that I described, like the one in India, which is, they did a pilot with 60 million students and showed that it was highly successful in raising learning achievement among poor students and low achieving students. So thinking about other ways, not necessarily having everyone in grade 3 because they're 8 years old, or in grade 6 because they're 12 years old. Allowing students who move more quickly through some subjects to move quickly, and working more closely with the students who are having more difficulty learning, to give them more support. And this partnership that has been created with communities and with families could be taken advantage of, so we give more tools to parents as well to work with their students. In fact, in Jamaica, we did a pilot program 2 years ago in math, and we taught the parents math concepts. We did not do any interventions with the students or with the teachers. And we showed that with just 5 sessions with the parents to teach them basic mathematic concepts, this was for early learners, for kindergarten and grade 1, but just to show parents basic concepts and teach them how to talk about math in everyday situations, in the supermarket, counting fruits, cooking together, telling time, concepts of in front of, behind, next to, etc., grouping things. Those students showed a significant improvement in their math learning after just 5 sessions with their parents. So we know that by working with parents and helping and empowering them to work with their children at home, we can also make gains, especially with the lower performing students. Thank you.
Thank you much. Thank you very much, Dr. Khan. Thank you very much, Dr. Cole. At this time, we're going to be going into our first panel discussion. We'll be having 2 panel discussions, and we trust that all of us who are currently joined will be remaining for the entire day. The first panel discussion will be focusing on the experiences of teachers, students, and the school management personnel. We want to see what are the lessons coming out of the last couple of weeks for those persons. The moderator for this first panel, the moderators are Dr. Therese Ferguson, lecturer in Education for Sustainable Development and a member of the CCEP operations team. And she's supported online in Cave Hill by Dr. Verna Knight, who is a lecturer in Social Studies Education and also a member of the CCEP operations team. They'll introduce the members of that panel. The second panel will focus on the educational policy and support systems. The topic is COVID-19 educational policy and support systems, immediate and future considerations for greater inclusivity and sustainability. The first panel will come, and then we'll have some questions and answers in between, and then we'll come to the second panel. Please stay tuned.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this, our first panel discussion on COVID-19, the experiences of teachers, students, and school management. My name is Therese Ferguson Murray from the UE Mona campus here in Jamaica, and as Dr. Thompson indicated, my co-moderator is Dr. Verna Knight from the UE Cave Hill campus in Barbados. So before we get into what should be an extremely interesting panel discussion, let me just take a few moments to introduce our 5 panelists this morning. So we have with us Mr. Owen Reed. He is the president of the Jamaicans Association since September 2019. He is the principal of Russo Primary School in St. Andrews, a graduate of the MICO and Western Carolina University. We also have with us Mr. Julian Monrose. He is a qualified teacher who has served the education system in Lucia as a teacher and later as a principal. He has served the Lucia Teachers Union in various capacities, including as president, and is indeed its longest serving president to date. Dr. Hyacinth Harris She has enjoyed a long career in education, moving through the ranks from teacher to principal. She has also served as an education officer, acting in the Ministry of Education, Science, Technology, and Innovation. And Dr. Harris currently serves as the president of the Association of Public Primary School Principals and is also a member of the Board of Management of the Urdeston Teachers Training College in Barbados. Dr. Zoya Kincaid-Clark is a senior lecturer in early childhood education here at the UE campus in Mona, Jamaica. She has vast experience researching in the area of early childhood education and currently serves as an external examiner in early childhood education for the Joint Board of Teacher Education. She is also a member of Jamaica's Early Childhood Development Oversight Committee. And our fifth panelist, Ms. Thatcher Luton. She is the Guild President of the UE Cave Hill campus. She has served the UWI community in various ways through membership and presidencies of various committees, and she is currently preparing to read for a Master of Education degree in educational leadership. So we welcome our panelists. Each panelist will have 5 minutes to share about their organizations, challenges experienced during the pandemic, their responses to these challenges, and significant lessons learned. So welcome to you all, and we now invite Mr. Owen Speed to speak and share with us.
Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished gentlemen, principal of the Mona campus, Dr. Weber, Dr. Kanu Thompson, permanent secretary in the Ministry of Education, Dr. Grace McLean, and other distinguished guests. As we have seen so far, COVID-19 has brought about several challenges, and it has exposed many of the weaknesses in our system, as well as it has shown us some of the strengths in our system. I think that our principals and teachers across the island need to be commended on the effort that they have put in so far, and especially those who returned to school on June 8th. We are seeing that they have been very creative in what they are doing, and the children have benefited significantly over the past few weeks, a couple of weeks per se. And the Jamaica Teachers Association is pretty pleased with what we are seeing as we go around and just to observe and to support the principals and the members of staff, as well as students. Sometimes we got a chance to speak with the students as we went along our way. I must say that we visited over 40 high schools in recent times since the reopening, and our teams have been out there. I personally visited over 40, and our teams have been around the island in the form of our regional officers and volunteers. You know, as a caring, compassionate entity, the Jamaica Teachers Association, we have repeatedly called on the Ministry of Education to get into planning mode. We are always willing and able to facilitate that kind of collaborative effort. And at any time that we are called upon, we are ready to provide the necessary support and to, assist the government in coming up with policy framework to guide the process as we move along. We don't know when back to school will be. As far as we are concerned, we are playing by ear at this time, but we would love to get into a mode of planning. We'd like our teachers to be fully trained to deal with the challenges, to understand the operations of the platforms. And, we'd like our children as well to be a little bit more up to speed with the use of the technology And, you know, we want them to take the knowledge. That is what we are considering technology at this time for them. We want them to be willing and able to take the knowledge and to transform that into something worthwhile and meaningful. As we moved along, we noticed that in the schools, we are seeing quite a number of challenges. We know virtual teaching and learning must continue. As we are seeing it, we are noticing that the schools have been very creative, the school leadership, very, very creative in terms of organizing themselves, you know, using a blended approach where they have virtual teaching going on at the same time whilst they are having some sort of physical face-to-face interactions taking place. As we are seeing it, we are aware that it is very difficult to replace the face-to-face personal touch interaction. And, you know, we would love to have more in terms of infrastructure at the disposal of the teachers and the students at this time. We are seeing that there is a real divide, and some of the speakers before me mentioned some of them. There's a real serious, significant divide out there, and we would like, you know, our government and maybe private public sector partnerships to develop in a real way, and we need to move at pace when we are speaking about the development of infrastructure, because as we see it, we believe that the bandwidth must be expanded and hotspots should be provided where our children in particular, many of them have come from very poor backgrounds, and we love for a wider range of in terms of connectivity that should be provided for them so that they can access at little or no cost. We are seeing that in terms of the teachers, the educational practitioners, we are seeing that they have been digging deep into their pockets to sort of subsidize or maybe even to maintain the whole virtual teaching and learning process. And it would be remiss of us not to call on our ministers, let's say the Minister of Education as well as Finance, to look at something that they could do in terms of maybe reimbursing teachers for their spend in this regard, and maybe to look at topping up the software and technology allowance in short order. I don't think we have to wait until we have the negotiation at full speed, but we could look at doing that from now so that the teachers are resourced. We love the school system as we are seeing it. We are way behind in terms of providing devices for our students. And we noticed that while we were going around that they were lacking in that area. We'd love to see the system be a little bit saturated. In fact, we'd love our students to have the devices, the tablets for the teachers. That's another one. These are some of the things that we think we'll need. And may I just point out that there is some distribution of tablets to our teachers at this time, but those are coming out of that salary negotiation that went on some years ago. So it is, to some extent, if we want to put it like that, it's really the personal property of the teachers rather than it being given as a tool to be used in the teaching learning process. But we know our teachers, and we know that they will be putting some of those tablets to use in the teaching learning process, and we have no difficulty with that. I think in terms of our teachers, we need to make sure that we have adequate personnel, and we might have been coming up short to some extent recently. So retention of our trained teachers must be an imperative going forward. You know, in terms of infrastructure, and I must say that we have gone to some schools. Some of these challenges that exist in the school system are not just going to disappear immediately, because they will take structural planning and they will take some amount of funding. So to do, so, you know, we went out and we saw also that many of our schools were not built to accommodate large gatherings anywhere, you know, in a comfortable setting. You know, schools without auditoriums, and I can categorically that I recently visited some of those, and I would really like to call on the powers that be to see what they can do in terms of building some structures that are big enough to accommodate cluster teaching. And when we say cluster teaching, where you put several classes together and have team teaching going on, because we want to move as far as possible from the shift system. And, you know, we have to look at all the other approaches. And infrastructure is going to be important. The STEM labs, and may I say that dealing with the infrastructural development, we looked at some schools, and I wanted to single out a few of them. I know they don't mind to say that they need a little bit of help to provide some of these facilities. I visited Camperdown, Seaford High, Paul Bogle, Donald Quarry. Those in particular, I think they need some assistance in putting up some structures that they can accommodate larger groups while abiding by this physical distancing guidelines set out by the Ministry of Health. At one school and some others too, but Paul Bogle, per se, perimeter fencing. You know, we want to ensure that our children are not circumventing the testing and the kind of sanitization that should take place at the school's entrance. And so if they are not properly fenced, then, you know, that could be some sort of a challenge with the school administration trying to ensure that they are properly sanitized and so on. STEM labs, we noticed that the STEM labs, you know, in some of the schools, science, technology, engineering, and math, some of these labs need some upgrading. And we know it's going to cost a pretty penny, but at the same time, we would love to have some sort of strategic planning in place where we look at the infrastructure and resources needed in order to ensure that we can have sustainable development in education going forward. A school bus system is something that I think we have missed a little bit of an opportunity during this reopening of school on a phased basis, because we have smaller numbers, and maybe it is that we could have and should have done a test run with a school bus system to ensure that, you know, going forward, we can look at that as something sustainable as well. There needs to be some sort of audit. We are seeing, though, where the ministry, and we must commend the Ministry of Education for conducting an audit. We know it's not complete, but I've seen where the principals are responding so far, and that's a good sign. It is a good step in the right direction. Of Educational Planning for inviting us, and we are very pleased, we are happy to be a part of this particular discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Speed. I'd like to now invite Mr. Julian Monrose to share with us. Just a reminder to the panelists to please 5 minutes or less, because we want to have time to take some questions and engage you in conversation further. So, Mr. Monrose, over to you.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for having me. I'm honored to be part of this webinar. I represent the St. Lucia Teachers Union, which is both a trade union and a professional organization. As a union, we advocate for teachers' welfare and better conditions of work. As a professional association of educators, we take a keen interest in the functioning of the overall education system. Our guiding principles are respect for human rights, decent work, social justice, and democracy. The COVID-19 pandemic raised new and urgent workplace issues for our educators, and above all, safety and well-being of students and teachers. In terms of health and safety, Since in this period, nothing could take precedence over the importance of safety, and since students and educators would be safest at home, the union called for and supported the early closure of schools. Of course, this decision to close schools forced the teachers to change from analog to digital teaching in a very short time. Having to do that created some problems for education and the education system. Moving classes online with just a few days to prepare was very difficult and stressful for teachers, partly because the vast majority had not previously taught online and there was little time to get trained in online teaching. Therefore, it meant also that the working conditions of the teachers had changed. We had students who were depending on their teachers to help them make sense of this new environment, this new, what some people call the new normal. Also, we knew that teachers were very eager to keep their students learning through this crisis. But there were serious challenges. One of them was that some students had no access to digital devices, and in many cases, no access to the internet. Students from disadvantaged households who relied on school meals had to be reached. The teaching and learning process was more difficult due to the lack of social contact, which of course we know being in school, the direct human contact would facilitate. And the issue of resources. Schools being closed, teachers had to depend on their personal resources, use of internet, phone data, etc., to ensure that the teaching and learning process continued. The work of the St. Lucia Teachers Union during this crisis made clear the need for organized labor, especially in times of crisis. The presence of the SLTU and the work that it did provided members with the assurances that they needed so that they can go about doing the work of teaching the student, understanding that the union was taking care of their business. Of course, the SLTU had its own challenges of having to close its offices. However, during that period, we increased dialogue with the Ministry of Education and other government agencies. We throughout insisted on the importance of safeguarding health and safety. When the government announced the partial reopening of schools, the union had to ensure that the necessary risk assessments were done and that risk mitigation measures were put in place. During that period, we increased our communication with members and activated new channels for doing so. During the partial opening, we have had to increase our monitoring of schools. We were able to ensure the effective implementation of stringent health and safety guidelines for the partial opening of schools. During the period, the government sought to cut teachers' salaries by offering payment in a blended modality of 50% bonds and 50% cash. The SLTU was able to resist that effort very successfully. The union ensured regular and timely information and update to members. This was aimed at minimizing uncertainty, stress, and anxiety. Due to the crisis and the challenges faced, the union increased dialogue with other actors in the education system. The SLTU believes that the COVID-19 crisis would be the catalyst for action to address some systemic problems impacting the education system. The pandemic revealed that our schools were unprepared to create an alternative form of education in times of crisis. As a first step, there is need to encourage our teachers and schools to share best practices and there should be a system-wide documentation and sharing of those ideas. In the medium to long term, we expect that our government, through the Ministry of Education, will look at reforming the education system to make its crisis response more effective, speed up efforts to bring broadband access to the entire country, ensure equity is achieved in access to digital devices and online learning for every student. Also develop programs that will assist parents in supporting students' learning generally, but particularly in times of crisis, and also to create a system of community support for education to provide for support in times of crisis. We believe that this is the way to go because we are certain that there will be other crises, but we have to prepare for it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Monrose. Quite an interesting experience that you have shared there. We now move to Dr. Hyacinth Harris and invite Dr. Harris to share from her perspective. Dr. Harris? She's dropped off. All right. Dr. Harris may have experienced some technical difficulties, so we'll move to Dr. Zoya Kincaid-Clark. Dr. Kincaid-Clark, please feel free to... All right.
Good morning.
Okay, good morning. Dr. Harris is back with us. So welcome, Dr. Harris, once again, and please share with us.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Professor Weber, Principal of UWI on the campus, Dr. Kanu Thompson, Head of the Caribbean Center for Educational Planning, all other distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen on the panel. Pleasant day to you all. Thank you for the invitation to be here. The Association of Public Primary School Principals was established just over 20 years ago and responds to matters affecting principals in primary, nursery, and special schools. Currently, we seek to represent the interests of all members whenever it is required, and we seek to promote professional and social interaction among our members. We also seek to establish and maintain relationships with other professional bodies such as teachers' colleges and universities, etc. As an organization, we seek to share and express informed opinions on educational matters of national interest and to actively participate in the formulation of educational policies. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic was really an interruption that has catapulted us towards teaching that, while not totally new, was thrust upon us even before we were ready. So virtual teaching and learning was the only response that supported the continuity in education. The fact that principals and teachers weren't ready meant that there were challenges in planning, executing, and managing the teaching and learning because of the short window of time that was available. And because of what occurred, we found ourselves confronted with several challenges. First of all, there was the abrupt closure of schools and preparations for online teaching. And this related to principals and teachers getting ready for or transitioning to the online environment. It necessitated organizing training sessions. For the most part, these were done through the Ministry of Education, Technological and Vocational Training. However, within the schools themselves, there were principals who organized internal training with the assistance of the information technology coordinators that are assigned to each primary schools. Unfortunately, nursery and special schools were quite different because of their student populations. For while they too engaged in online teaching and learning, there appeared to be less urgency for them to start in the online environment. Another challenge that confronted us was access to technology for students and teachers to a lesser extent. This was one of the glaring realities with which we were faced. We recognized that there were several students who did not own technological devices. And while there were parents who used their mobile devices online occasionally, we also recognized that these were not ideal for the online teaching. And then as the country began to reopen in the past few weeks, some parents returned to work, so several students no longer had access. Another challenge with which principals primarily were confronted was the fact that we needed to prepare schedules for teachers in the online environment. Because whereas timetables were used in the schools, we now needed to sit and decide how we were going to organize schools for online teaching and learning, we recognized that the timetables could not be transposed to the online environment. And most principals were conscious of research out there from the World Health Organization and other creditable organizations that indicate that too much screen time will eventually have negative effects on students. So there was a concerted effort to organize the schedules so that we can have face-to-face teaching as well as synchronous teaching. Managing the online environment was also quite challenging for some of us as there was some uncertainty about when the third term would begin, and then principals also were expected to maintain contact with staff, students, and their parents. Maintaining the contact with staff and students and parents was paramount because these are members of the school family. So as principals, we needed to find a strategy for keeping these persons connected and also to demonstrate some level of empathy with those who are experiencing unforeseen circumstances. One last challenge, which I will air in this forum, is the fact that when schools ended abruptly in March, many of the primary schools were preparing the class 4 students for the Barbados Secondary Schools entrance examination. However, the abrupt closure meant that these children now had to resort to online teaching. And this exam, which is a relatively high-stake exam, needs thorough preparation. But there were some steps that were taken to mitigate the circumstances. As an association, we engaged in several online meetings to hear the principals' concern. Our executive is currently divided into groups so that each member of the executive responds to a particular group of principals. We've also had quite a bit of dialogue with the Ministry of Education to ensure that systems were put in place for all school principals and teachers to be trained and to ensure that everyone was clear about the expectations. The ITCs were expected to organize the training for staff, and this has been ongoing since the lockdown. We, as an organization, we have made several proposals to the ministry. All of them have been trained so far, and that's to the credit of the Ministry of Education as well as the principals in the schools who ensure that the ITCs put those programs in place. In order for our students to access the online teaching and learning, we've had several donations to the school, some through the Ministry of Education and others through the Principals Association and through individual schools. Principals have also been conscious of students needing to have care packages to help their families. So we've done quite a bit of that. Our class 4 students returning to schools, this has been a template for the possibilities for September when we finally open schools fully. And I can say that in terms of our successes, there is increased or improved dialogue with the ministry, and this is ongoing, and this is something that the association has been asking for a very long time. And our principals are better prepared now for using a blended approach to school management. The reopening to students, we've asked ourselves in terms of what are the best strategies? How do we encourage students to be responsible for their health and safety? These are questions that still need to be answered, since it may be difficult to keep our students apart, since they're naturally gregarious and often very adventurous. Questions like how the student population will be organized so that no student is disadvantaged. We've considered things like staggered schooling initially. These are options that we have, allowing a specific group of the school population to be in the plant at a particular time. Monitoring the teachers, that's another area that we have to look at. How do we capture data in terms of student attendance and teachers' activities? These are absolutely necessary. But in the long term, we have to recognize that the global trend is towards technology. So there must be a greater thrust towards ensuring that school administrators are on the cutting edge and are technologically savvy to lead their schools. The policymakers at the level of the Ministry of Education, as well as school administrators, must always be proactive. We must observe the trends in education in the global community as well as in our local communities, so that we can prepare for any eventualities. And we can learn from the experiences of individuals who have passed through this so far and have reopened. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harris. Again, quite some interesting experiences and insights being shared. So we now move on to Dr. Zoya Kincaid-Clark. Welcome, Dr. Kincaid-Clark, and we invite you to share.
Good morning, everyone. All protocols duly observed. Thank you very much for inviting me to this presentation. It really has been interesting thus far. When we talk about how has COVID affected the teaching and learning and management of schools for young children, we're really talking about how well are we prepared to manage to deal with 21st century learners without 21st century capacities and capabilities. And that's something that's very important, because for young children who learn in unique ways, how are they able to navigate this new normal, especially in light of many of the challenges that many of them face? So really and truly is that every facet of society has been affected by COVID-19, and young children in the early years are particularly vulnerable and are very sensitive to the smallest shifts and changes in their everyday lives. And while children are resilient, the challenges that have been wrought by the massive shifts have affected them in several ways. And we talk about holistic development in the early years. We talk about socially, emotionally, we talk about physically, affectively, and cognitively. But particularly at this point in time, while we know that there will be some cognitive issues from the teaching in terms of ability to learn, and not a huge part of it has to do with the socio-emotional side of learning and how they're going to navigate all of this. For young children, being uncertain of what is happening, what has happened to their friends, what has happened to their schools, their teachers, it really isn't an easy thing for them to understand. And we know, just as how the other presenters have noted, that there are differences along socioeconomic lines. This is also the reality in many Jamaican institutions. What we know in Jamaica is that young children are at risk. Young children are more likely to live in poverty than any other age group. So a child below the age of 4, just by virtue of his or her age, is more likely to live in poverty, even more so than their parents. And so when you look at that, you're looking at how poverty affects them in a number of ways. So there's some real issues that we have to look at. We have to look at how prepared are their parents to manage to support them at this point. How are prepared are the parents to be able to teach them, to support them, to work with them, to support their social development at this point in time. Young children are very vulnerable, and so they need specific tools and strategies. And parents who are dealing with and managing the day-to-day experiences and rudimentary daily lives how do they support or recognize that young children need this kind of support? Young children are often put at the end rather than at the beginning in terms of any kind of support. So you have a parent has 3 children, one in primary school, one in secondary school, one in an early childhood institution. More than likely, the parent will privilege the secondary child and primary age child over the early childhood one, because there is the assumption that not much is happening in the early childhood institutions and they just play around, they will catch up at some point in time. So these are some of the realities that we face. We also know that teachers in early childhood institutions are really struggling. Now, what we don't understand is that in Jamaica, the majority of our early institutions are privately owned and operated. And because of this, prior to COVID-19, many of them were struggling. So you can well imagine that after COVID-19 or during this time, during the time of COVID-19 and the transition out of COVID-19, if there is ever such a time, it will be worse. And I have had the opportunity to speak with many administrators and teachers of institutions. Some teachers have already been laid off from school. Some administrators have acknowledged that they don't know if they will be able to open back up when school ought to open in September. That's a question mark. And so you're looking at all of this. The financial aspect of it is also something that we have to consider. And so, listening to Mr. Speed and hearing about some of the initiatives from the government that teachers in primary schools have been able to, participate in. Early childhood institutions do not benefit from those. And so even the point of the provision of tablets and other technological devices, early childhood teachers do not have access to those. Many of them, the low salaries that they earned prior to, they didn't have those capacities. And so even now, teachers are left on their own. We're looking at this. So many young children are really sitting at home, not doing anything much. So we know there are challenges, but we also know that there is a huge potential for change. So we know that we look at the problems, we have acknowledged that there are several problems, but what are those areas that we can look at in terms of growth and development for early childhood institutions? This presents a wonderful opportunity for collaboration with other institutions, perhaps at the primary school level. This also provides a wonderful opportunity for teachers to transform pedagogical approaches. This also provides a wonderful opportunity for school leaders, should their schools be able to survive this pandemic, to come up with some creative and unique ways and to look at education in a broader, more all-encompassing way. So those are really some of the things that we can look at as we push forward, as we move forward. It really is a challenging time for young children. They learn in unique ways, and technology is not always the best means through which to facilitate the unique ways in which they learn.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Kincaid Clark. Really insightful. So to round us off, before we move on to a period of questions, we have Ms. Thatcher Luton. Ms. Luton, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Please share with us.
All right, so thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be a part of this panel. At this time, I'm going to say all protocols observed. I'm just going to talk a little about the Guild of Students and what we do and what I do as Guild President, my personal insights, and just some recommendations as it relates to the educational system going forward. So as evidently, we're currently amid a worldwide trial that has changed our lives. That's very evident. The Guild of Students, we're actually entrusted with promoting and fostering and developing the educational, social, cultural, and economic interests of Guild members. And when we say Guild members, we're talking about our students. Not only that, but as Guild President, I actually lead the student representation system to make sure that students are effectively represented. Also, as the Guild of Students, we work alongside the university to enhance the educational experience of all students. we actually ensure that the university places student interest at the heart of every university decisions. Not only that, we also make sure that university is constantly acting in the interest of the students. In addition to that, the Guild of Students, we're also responsible for student social engagements on campus. As we can imagine, with the government policies and campus health safety measures as it relates to social distancing, no planned activity for second semester starting from March was able to, we weren't able to execute any of these activities. And so the students were basically at a disadvantage. We operate a students union as well, and this students union is a multi-purpose facility run by the Guild of Students. It is really the center of student activities, both culturally and entertainment, and it is basically the perfect spot on campus to lime, to relax, to unwind from the academics, and this is a social aspect, but with the government putting in place and the campus itself putting in place social distancing, we weren't able to facilitate our students in the students union, and so this was a bit of a problem. Not only that as well, but the Guild of Students, we operate businesses, and so it was very difficult in facilitating payment to our suppliers, and therefore it was really a setback for us. But as a student leader and as a leader who operates the Guild of Students to ensure that the Guild of Students as an organization is fully up and running, there were 3 questions I actually asked myself during this pandemic, and these 3 questions are, how can we manage dramatic change? How can we solve complex problems? How can we lead in a state of emergency? And so one of the things I was able to do as a leader was, I didn't try to steer the ship alone, but I had to dip into my team, and I'm talking about my council, for their diverse opinions, and this was how we were able to channel through these challenges. It also led me to think, not only when planning for the academic year, not only to plan for a full academic year, but to plan beyond. Think of different ways in the future, think of add technology to our planning, add the right platform to our planning. So actually, it led me to think about these things. But one thing from a personal insight is that the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrates to us the value of freedom. The COVID-19 highlights the need for vigilance, for new narratives, and reform government institutions. The COVID-19 as well as forced organizations across nearly every industry to alter how they deliver products and services, and I'm talking from the Guild of Students perspective as well. And not only that, but the entire education sector, for example, had to close to facilitate and move to distance learning model. And this has multiple repercussions for IT. As Guild President, I had to deal with the different issues students faced on a daily basis, because I'm almost sure that they weren't prepared. Not even the university was really prepared to transition from face-to-face learning, from face-to-face teaching to online classes. And so it was a challenge, but I must commend the UE and our very capable principals who put together the training for our lecturers to do the online Blackboard collaborations and Zoom classes. It was a success. There were a little bit of hiccups, but it was a success. But personally, I'm speaking about the education now. I am glad that these difficult times are driving innovation in education. It is nice to see that something good came from this, even though it was a pandemic and we were not prepared, but we can always say that something good came from this pandemic. Education has changed very little over the last few years, and yet students should be prepared for a job market where things change rapidly. So innovation is a must. And I must say, thankfully to technology, it has become a central aspect of the modern day education experience, with many teachers and students already experienced in teaching and learning with the digital support. And not only that, while the government guidance regarding school closures and social distancing has resulted in a greater digital uptake. Yesterday, I had the opportunity of speaking with an educator in a personal interview, and I was asking him what are his personal insights. And one of the things he highlighted to me, one of the things he posited to me was that it was a challenge of students' initial reluctance in using technology to complete assignments. And I'm almost sure many teachers would have had this challenge. Dr. Verna Knight is actually the moderator now on this panel, and she's a lecturer as well. She's one of my lecturers as well, and she did very well at the online platform, so I must commend her for that. But going forward, I believe that when it comes to education, we need to strengthen an approach that promotes the well-being of people on the planet. We need education that goes beyond providing basic knowledge and skills and leads to awareness, ideas, and action that help us to advance towards sustainable development. I'm almost sure that students, their parents, and educators around the world are feeling the extraordinary ripple effect of the novel coronavirus as schools are shutting down and quarantine methods are being ordered to cope with the global pandemic. As I close, I will say while governments and health officials are doing their best slowing down the outbreak, global education systems are collaborating to collectively respond and provide quality education for all these difficult times. And that is what I love. I love to see the collaboration. And as schools around the world transition to online learning during the COVID-19 pandemic, students, parents, and educators are all wondering, and they're all wondering what this means for education in the future. And while it may seem difficult to predict how the future will unfold during such uncertain times, some of the most pioneering work happening around us can guide us in our thinking. And so I will leave with just a few questions. Well, maybe not questions, but just a few insights. We can say digital education is catching up and probably may surpass traditional classroom education. We can no longer assume that traditional classroom education is the best education. And also, I will leave by saying the difference will be that online learning will be more acceptable and credible in the future. And not only that, but we can not only rely on students and employers or employees to take on the burden of this transition, and I'm speaking from the educational background aspect. Our companies and our educational systems must also be transformed first. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very, very much. Our panelists have given us a lot to think about. I will now turn over to my co-moderator, Dr. Knight, to take us through the question-answer portion of this panel discussion. Dr. Knight?
Thank you very much, Dr. Ferguson. And very conscious of time at this moment, we want to say thanks to our contributors who have quite ably shared their experiences of teachers, of students, and generally school management as it relates to lessons and insights that we can even pull together at this stage as we manage this COVID-19 crisis in education. We have been observing some of the comments and general discussions that have been taking place in our online chat forum through the YouTube link. And I'll just try to pull them together into three broad questions that we'll pose to the panel and we'll ask you to respond to. They generally relate to teachers, and so we want to ask the representatives for the unions, especially to take note at this point of these questions, and even Dr. Kincaid Clark, because there's one that relates to early childhood. So as we listen to the experiences of the union representatives and the principals, we have certainly heard of the visits you've been making to schools, as some schools have reopened and some are preparing to reopen. And one of the questions generally speaks to how are you monitoring the quality of online teaching and learning? So we've been hearing about some of the observations you've been making as you visit schools. As you look at the online platform itself, how have principals been managing the quality of online teaching and learning? And what are any observations you've gained thus far? I want to begin by throwing that out to Mr. Speed and then Mr. Monrose and Ms. Harris. If you can just take a minute and respond to that, that would be quite helpful.
Okay. We have had some schools have set up their own systems. The principals get information from the teachers. Some of them have been doing continuous assessment, and out of that, they are compiling. They have not finished compiling what it is that they need to compile in order to come to a final conclusion, really, on what it is that they are seeing coming out. But at the end of this maybe 4-week period, they will be in a little better position to say how effective online teaching was.
Okay, Mr. Monrose?
Yes, in St. Lucia, the planning and preparation has continued as you would have had traditionally. Assessment has continued. So planning in the schools with various classes at the same grade, the teachers are expected to continue doing their joint planning and to execute and to provide regular reports to the teachers. And also, as I said, the assessment of students continue. What we attempted to do, what we agreed with the Ministry of Education, that as much as possible, teachers would not delve into too many new topics with the students, but would seek to keep them engaged and do a lot of review and remedial work.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Harris?
In the case of Barbados, I can simply say that we have been using the G Suite platform, and there was an agreement with the Ministry of Education to allow teachers to simply review concepts taught in terms 1 and 2. So our teachers have not been engaged in any new concepts during this academic term. We have simply been reviewing, and in order to manage the online classroom and to observe what is happening so that quality teaching is still occurring, our principals visit classrooms online. So for the most part, teachers do lots of face-to-face teaching, and where they are unable to do that, then they do what we call asynchronous teaching, where they post assignments for students, videos to watch, etc. So principals are able to log in into the teachers' classrooms and observe how they are presenting information, whether it is face-to-face or whether it is asynchronously. And we have seen lots of relatively good experiences from the classroom experience.
Okay. Now, when you were presenting, various presenters were presenting, we kept hearing face-to-face, and I'm understanding that we mean live teaching using the Zoom or the Google Suite platforms, whatever platforms we've been using. So where the teachers are in live session with students. So that's just clarity for our audience. The second question I have relates to some of the comments we've been seeing in the chat that speaks to concern for those students who are at risk. And so this question here, if you can respond to that, it would be helpful. How have teachers and schools sought to remain connected to at-risk students? We heard of instances where devices have been lacking and where connectivity have been identified issues. Can you just share with us from your observation so far some ways that teachers and schools have been able to remain connected to at-risk students during this period? Mr. Speed, we'll begin with you again. Mr. Speed, you're muted.
Okay, good, thanks. The challenges are real. There are numerous challenges out there. Connectivity is an issue, but we have seen where teachers, schools have had parents and relatives come in to pick up papers and so on, and to get out there to the children in their communities where they are unable to be reached by the platforms. And, but it is a real challenge. Some of them have real difficulties providing the data for the connections and so on. But in many instances, teachers have been giving credit to children so that they can come onto the platforms in many, many instances. But that is unsustainable. It's untenable to do that. But that's basically the way they are going. And as we say, we would like to have more assistance coming from central government to provide the connectivity for more of our children.
Okay. Any observations from St. Lucia, Mr. Monrose?
Basically, the experience in St. Lucia is just as my brother from Jamaica has explained. Just that in some cases, though a little dangerous, we also had teachers in the various communities actually delivering packages to homes and collecting packages. So we had the situation where some parents would come to the school, but we know not every parent is sufficiently responsible. And so we know of many cases where the teachers went around the community delivering packages and collecting packages from students.
Okay. Dr. Harris, is there any different observations on Barbados?
Well, in the case of Barbados, we've had a thrust towards accumulating some technological devices for our students. From the outset, the Ministry of Education sent a needs assessment to every primary and secondary school, and they use this information to contact parents so that those students who are at risk can receive the devices to use in the online classroom. But apart from the technology, we know that there are students who are at risk in terms of their families being able to provide what they need on a day-to-day basis. And so several principals have been delivering care packages to families and so on. Teachers as well have formed groups so that individual families would not suffer as a result of this pandemic and families being out of work. So I believe that even though we place emphasis on the technology and catering to the needs of the students in terms of ensuring that they are online, the fact that many of them, these at-risk students, also suffer, their families also suffer economically is also very important. And we have been responding to that as well.
Okay, thank you. That is great to hear, because the teachers are certainly one of the best resources we have for identifying those at-risk students. And the final comment we're going to ask Dr. Kincaid-Clark to make relates to the early childhood group, and this has certainly been an area of concern, a group that is many persons are expressing concern about. Have you heard about any success stories as it relates to using the online platform to reach early childhood, the early childhood group, Dr. Kincaid-Clark? That's one of the questions we had from the online chat.
Thanks for that. Well, there certainly are some heard of children, perhaps those from more privileged backgrounds, who have been doing quite well. We also know that you have some very creative and ingenious teachers who have been really trying to meet their students where they are. I've heard of a principal and teachers who have uploaded videos to YouTube for parents to be able to access when they have time. And so knowing that there's one phone in the household, teachers and principals have tried to be very creative in reaching their students. So that's certainly one of the ways, that's certainly a success story that I have heard and had the opportunity to speak with the administrator about. So that's something that, teachers and administrators have really been going about trying to do. So that's definitely one success story.
Okay, and thank you very much, panel.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I am Maxine Henry Wilson. I am a member of the CCEP organizational group, and our next panel is going to talk about some of the immediate and future considerations for greater sustainability and inclusivity based on our experiences of COVID-19, and will focus on educational policy and support systems. We have 5 panelists, and I will introduce them as they are about to make their presentations. I'm going to emphasize that we need to contain our presentations to 5 minutes, and we will be monitoring because we want everyone to get a chance, not just to present, but also for us to have discussion, questions and answers. So we have here this morning. We'll start with Mr. Gordon, Mr. Rafa Gordon. I think you corrected how your name was pronounced. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. Mr. Gordon is the Senior Technical Specialist for Education of the Education Development Management Unit of the OECS Commission. His particular interests are the imperatives of the OECS education sector strategy and its cross-cutting themes such as teacher quality and teacher professional development. He is a former curriculum specialist with responsibility for English with the Ministry of Education, St. Lucia, and specializes in literacy and language study. He also has a great level of competence and fluency in Spanish. Mr. Gordon, your presentation, please.
Good morning to all. Thank you, Madam Moderator. A special thanks to the committee for allowing the OECS Commission an opportunity to share in this presentation and this wonderful exercise. The OECS is guided by the revised Treaty of Bastia, and the OECS Commission as one of the organs of that organization has a mandate that focuses on harmonization of systems, coordinating the efforts by the various member states, and mobilizing resources to be able to meet the needs of the member states as well. So essentially, it is a case of bringing our various member states together to be able to benefit each other with the resources that are available. The challenges imposed upon us by the COVID-19 situation are many. They're very varied. Just to touch on a few of them here, quality of instruction is certainly an issue that needs to be closely monitored. It needs to be considered carefully. While we have teachers who are very competent and who are very skilled, very creative, who have shown their mettle and have responded to the challenges imposed by COVID, there are others who do not have the requisite training, experience, the expertise, or the will in some cases to be able to respond to the needs that have been identified. And so certainly there are issues with what level and quality of instruction children are being exposed to. There are also challenges in monitoring the instruction to assure quality. Finances are also a challenge. They very much relate to access and equity. There are some persons who are able to connect with the online learning, others are not able to, either because they do not have devices or they do not have connectivity. And in some cases, you may have a family where 3 or 4 children are operating on just one device. And so automatically it affects the ability of each child to participate. In those circumstances, we're finding that the younger ones have less access than the older ones. There's the burden of the new, that is that persons were not prepared for this pandemic and for the implications. There's also the reality that many of the teachers who are expected to meet the needs of children have children of their own, and they have to monitor and manage those children. They have to support the children's instruction in the home. And so it poses a serious burden on those educators. There's the issue of managing expectations. The expectations may not always be ideal, or they may not always be realistic. And those expectations span the entire system, from the Ministry of Education down to schools, parents, and the public. Persons may think that learning from home should function in one particular way, but these may not necessarily meet the realities or what evidence demonstrates. And of course, monitoring and evaluation is quite a challenge, because the space is a totally new one, and people monitoring people in so many different spaces online is really a challenge. In terms of the response to the COVID-19 situation. The Education Development Management Unit of the OECS Commission has developed a regional strategy in collaboration with the various ministries of education that has 4 focus areas. The first one deals with harmonization of policy response amongst member states. And we recognize that because this is largely a novel environment, we need to consider the policy implications to ensure that structures are in place to provide the relevant support. We have undertaken a rapid assessment of learning management systems because there were very limited controls on exactly what was happening. There's also an academic recovery program that we are presently designing to be able to meet the needs of students who are most affected by the pandemic. The focus area 2 is a transition to distributed learning. We're looking at devices and not just online learning, but looking at distributed learning so that we're considering all of the modalities that children can use or teachers can use to provide the adequate quality educational experiences for students. We're talking about personalized learning, web learning. We're talking also about using applications so that when children are not connected to the internet, learning can continue. Mixing that with some face-to-face where the health protocols allow, as well as even print, video, television, radio, all of these come together. Focus 3 is looking at the psychosocial component, ensuring that health is considered as well, because the situation, because it is so new and because there are many psychological issues associated, have implications for the learning that children would really be able to demonstrate. And so it means that these cannot be forgotten. And in promoting engagement, focus area 4, we recognize that persons need proper messaging. We need to ensure that persons have a proper understanding of the expectations that we spoke about earlier and how best we can meet the needs. A very important initiative that the OECS Commission is partnering with a number of other agencies, it's called GIGA. It's an initiative to connect every school to the internet, and that project has already commenced. Essentially, we're looking at ensuring that when children have devices and that they have the tools to be able to connect, that online learning can happen because of connectivity as well. We have established 2 teams, a content development team and a continuity of learning team. The content development team is looking at evidence-based approaches to teaching and learning and using that as a framework for developing materials that students and teachers, parents as well, can use with learning from home so that it reduces the burden on the teachers. The continuity of learning team is developing a set of guidelines. It will become a manual for having learning continue regardless of any situation that may interrupt. So it goes way beyond the COVID situation, and it looks at any interruption to teaching and learning. The teams come from across the region, the content development team, as well as the continuity of learning team. And these education professionals work collaboratively on these activities. Here are some key principles, key considerations that the team use as a guide: constructivism, game-based learning, inquiry-based learning, project-based learning, so that while children are not in the physical classroom, the learning opportunities that they have would be high quality. They would develop creativity, they would develop critical thinking, they would be able to explore their world, and learning would be representative of exactly what we want it to be. There are some major projects that the teams are undertaking: learning from home, sustainable use of home resources. It's a video series where persons or parents would be able to see models of how they can engage with basic activities at home that provide opportunities for learning. It could be, for instance, that you're cooking with the child and you use resources from the cooking, you use the waste from the cooking in a kitchen garden as part of composting. So there are many opportunities for science learning, for English language learning, social studies. All of the areas can come together. We're also exploring tours and web-based games so that the experiences are meaningful. A very important highlight that has come out of the COVID response is the OECS ESI News. Essentially, students are prepared to develop reports on their experience, and they share those reports in an actual professional news broadcast. And here is just a quick feature of what that looks like. And finally, the key considerations, lessons, and insights coming out of that COVID-19 experience. These are the kinds of things that we've identified as focus areas, things that we must give attention to ensure that teaching and learning remain at the optimum, and that we create the policy environment to support the learning that students are expected to acquire. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gordon. We'll now move to our second presenter, Dr. Grace McLean, who is the Acting Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Youth. Dr. is an eminent educator, having included in the Chief Education Officer in the Ministry prior to her current position. She has also worked with Hart NTA for many years as a senior program. She was with career and education, among other level qualifications.
Thank you very much, Maxine, our minister and the commissioner, Dr. of this team, members of the panel, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good morning. We appreciate there's no COVID-19 affecting we respond to the pandemic. The makeup developed our nation schools well the Ministry of Health and Wellness. On March 12, when the Prime Minister announced the suspension of schools to mitigate the spread of the disease, this led to another round of adjustments as we sought to address continuing education for students, recognizing that some amount of educational opportunities would need to be provided while our students are out of school. We truly appreciated the great effort that our teachers made as it relates to this sudden change. We realized that they needed to be familiarized or more familiarized with the use of online methods, which we really did not have the time for the actual preparation. But somewhere during the process, we were able to use the education in areas that I will and platforms we establish platform that for our students at the level, producing of the rapid production of materials for radio and television, and we had almost all of our radio stations involved in some kind of educational programs for our students across the country to access. And importantly, the printing and distribution of material where there was no internet access. In addition, we were able to procure packages from our internet providers to assist our students, and also to secure other providers who are currently assisting our students in getting access. We also started, or we improved or rapidly improved the procurement and the acquiring and distribution of tablets to both teachers and students, and we are currently in that phase as we speak. We also provided nutritional grants, cash grants, for the last 3 months, and in early March we had to use our mechanism to provide baked products, milk and water to schools for parents to access for their children. Having gone through that period, ladies and gentlemen, we are now in the refresher phase of preparations. Schools reopened on June 8 for our examination students, which total about 129,000 students from grade 11 through to grade 13. Now, before we actually opened, we were engaged in active preparation as it relates to the training of our school administrators, and also in the procurement of materials, sanitizing materials, masks and temperature guns and so on were provided to all our high schools and most of our private institutions. We found that our schools administrators have risen to the challenge, and so the new seating matrix, staggering of classes, changing in terms of the timetable, a new approach in terms of the provision of meals, the constant or the regular disinfecting and cleaning of surfaces within our schools, the preparation of wash stations with soap and the necessary provision for our students, temperature checks, signage to guide our students in terms of social physical distancing, counseling support, isolation room, all the things that we were advised by the Ministry of Health we were able to put in place. And we had our health inspectors actually assessing our schools and giving the clear before we were able to engage our students. Our school leaders actively participated in all the training exercises that we had with the Ministry of Health, and within a 1-week period with the technology we were able to train close to 6,000 of our administrators. So this limited reopening of school, as you heard from our JTA president before, has gone very well, and we can only give the credit to our hardworking educators who continue to support this process. So the school term will officially end on July 3, and we will see our students moving into their examinations, which will effectively end somewhere around July 4. And then we will now move into the more active preparation for the start of the new school year, which I will spend a minute or two on to update you as to where we are at. So ladies and gentlemen, the research has been done thanks to IDB, UNICEF, UNESCO, World Bank and other international development partners. We have identified an approach using the 6 feet distancing, and through partnerships we believe we will be able to find enough space to accommodate our students, partnerships with churches, private schools, available spaces, and also the use of the wide expanse of lands that we have on some of our school compounds by the erection of tents and temporary structures. We already know that a mixed modality will be utilized, which will include the wide use of technology. Our schools have started to develop their reopening plans, and this is going exceptionally well. Mr. Speed spoke about the data earlier. We now know also that technology will form a part of the new normal, and so we have commenced the procurement of a national school management system that will see us being able to pull all that we do together. We expect that by the first to the second week in July, we will have the full implementation plan ready for the dissemination to the system, but we have to clear and have all the consultations done before this plan can be made public. Extensive training is currently being arranged through the Jamaica Teaching Council, as well as the University of the West Indies Open Campus, among other partners. Our guest speaker actually spoke about what Finland is willing to support us on, and we look forward to that support as well. So we will take up the challenge of ensuring that our teachers are properly trained. Now, as I heard some of the speakers spoke about the nature of the teaching learning process that has taken place within the last 4 or so months, we had guided the system as well that they should limit the introduction of new concepts. We know that some regression would have taken place, and so for the first 3 weeks in September, we will be administering a special assessment in selected subject areas across the system to identify the gaps and to determine how these gaps will be filled forward for the new school year. So, ladies and gentlemen, the ministry has been very responsive, and we can only give the credit to our hardworking educators across the length and breadth of Jamaica, who all came together and allowed the world and specifically the country to realize that teachers are our greatest assets. We have made some mistakes. We have corrected them along the way. We continue to correct some that we have made, and we are very optimistic that the opportunities that have been provided through the COVID-19 will serve this education system very well by providing greater equity and access, and of course greater results and outcomes for our Jamaican children. Thank you.
For that very comprehensive review and our actions going forward. Miss Nicole Lynch is our next. Mrs. Nicole Lynch is our next presenter. She's a registered counseling psychologist and a certified positive discipline educator, and her professional activities focus on child and youth mental health, parenting, and education reform. Over the last 10 years, she has been a consultant with organizations such as UNICEF and OECS on projects related to improving the psychosocial learning environment for children and adolescents, a topic which we have heard referred to frequently today and before. So, Mrs. Lynch?
Good morning, everyone. Protocol having been duly observed, I want to say thank you very much for the opportunity to be a part of the conversation on building resilient schools here in our precious Caribbean. I want to do so from the perspective of psychology and just what we know about what children need to do well and to be well. So I want to say that children have been experiencing significant challenges before COVID came along in terms of their mental health and their well-being. Here in the Caribbean in particular, we've had a significant challenge with child abuse. The research has shown us that sometimes for many children, that first sexual occurrence happens forced, and it happens before the age of 10. So we recognize that there are pre-existing challenges that children and adolescents in the Caribbean have faced, but COVID-19 has also brought new challenges. It's also brought rapid, unprecedented change. There's so many times I've said to myself and to others in conversations, we've never been here before as a world. And change in and of itself often presents a challenge to our mental health. So psychologically speaking, we recognize that these challenges must be a part of the response from an education policy perspective, and they must be addressed holistically to ensure that the issues of social emotional intelligence are at the table when we look at how we help children to recover from the experiences of the past 6 months. So our children are going to need our help understanding what has happened. They'll need our help dealing with the challenges and the changes that have come up. They will need help healing and coping with the fear, the anxiety, the worries of the past 6 months, and the new worries to come when they go back to school, as some children may be, fearful of, well, I've been told to stay at home, but now I'm being told I need to go to school. Is it really safe? So much will need to be done to really ensure that we're meeting our children's social and emotional health. As I mentioned before, there were some pre-existing challenges that were being faced by our children in this region. Child abuse, I spoke to that in terms of the childhood sexual abuse. I also want to say that children in the early childhood area, in the early childhood ages, are also particularly vulnerable to child abuse. That 0 to 4 age group, international literature as well as literature in the Caribbean has said, that is a time of heightened risk of abuse. We recognize that stress, parental stress, is a key factor at times in child abuse, as well as, perhaps this is just how I have been trained and this is what I do. So with COVID coming along, we now have a situation where parents are extremely stressed because they have new roles. They're playing the role of teacher. They're also being expected in many cases to work from home and to be productive. Those expectations have not gone. So there are challenges also economically. And with this stress, there comes also the heightened possibility of increased levels of abuse. And even in those cases, as we are seeing from some research coming out of UNICEF, we've seen that parental views and attitudes towards the use of corporal punishment have changed, where parents are saying, we are now seeing there are other ways. But as we think about building resilient schools, we must consider that when these stresses come, sometimes regressions can also come in these gains that we have made. So with mental health challenges, we recognize that students, teachers, and families before COVID were having instances that led them to experience trauma. When I say trauma, I refer to anything that overwhelms our capacity to cope. And I feel like COVID just personifies the capacity for people to feel trauma or traumatized. But that was with us before. We have children in the Caribbean region who are still traumatized by the hurricanes that they experienced in the past few years. When it rains, the teachers have to step in and really try to settle them and help them to calm. Past panelists also spoke about the poverty that has already been with us and the impact that can have on a learning brain, as well as the social and economic inequalities. The pressures of, well, my mommy or my daddy cannot give me this tablet that I need to do my work. And maybe I'm going to fall behind. Maybe I won't be able to reach those goals that I had set for myself that I thought would finally be a way out of this stress that my family faces through poverty. So we also have the new reality for some children, which poses a challenge. With children's development, socialization, and play, especially for young children, but I believe for all, we all need to play for our well-being. That has been challenged when we are continually hearing the important message of we have to social distance. So that, I think, has been a challenge. Children as well may be experiencing feelings of confusion, isolation, and lack of control, sadness, not really knowing what to do with what they're experiencing. I spoke to parental stress as well. So we have had some promising things that have given us hope. The Child Friendly Schools Initiative, which is being implemented in many schools as a result of the work of UNICEF and OECS, has, I think, much to offer for such a time as this. One of the countries, Antigua and Barbuda, has sought to continue to build on what they have, the gains they have through the implementation of the Child Friendly School Initiative, by recognizing that our parents are being stressed and they will need help in disciplining their children in a manner that reduces the likelihood of abuse. So they have launched a media campaign with ads targeting parents with skills that they can use in the home. We also have the Return to Happiness program, which existed pre-COVID, but which has recently been revised to ensure that teachers and parents now know how to implement the Return to Happiness program, which is a program which traditionally has been implemented after hurricanes to help children to cope with the trauma they may have experienced and return to some level of functioning with hope. So in terms of insights and lessons, I want to say that the time has come to seriously recognize the importance of social and emotional wellness for learning and as a fundamental aspect of quality education. Sometimes as I've done training with teachers, you know, they said, well, Mrs. Lynch, this is good. We recognize this is important, but the curriculum, the exams, we don't have time. I think the time has come where we recognize that it is no longer a side dish, but it is a part of the main menu, as well as recognizing that for resilient schools to happen, we must have resilient teachers, resilient students, and resilient families. So I really recommend the promotion of a foundation of social and emotional wellness, as well as the promotion of social and emotional learning for students, encouraging avenues like student councils for students' voices to be heard, as well as integrating the social and emotional learning component in the curriculum. I think the opportunity that this presents with us to build community is really heartening, but it will be for us to take up and be creative to find ways that even in the midst of social distancing, that we really focus on the important work of building community and developing those systems which foster predictability and sustainability. I also want to really stress the importance of support for teachers in as many ways as possible. And one of the ways that teachers will really need support right now is understanding how they can support their own social and emotional health as well as that of their students through the integration of it, as well as helping them to understand impact as well as how to respond. In terms of teachers' well-being, I encourage us to look at ways that we can invest in well-being support systems for teachers, maybe hotlines, mentoring support programs, as well as taking a very close look at how we can support parents. The reality is some parents just don't know how. So in an environment where it's so critical for them to know how to support their children, it will be important for schools as they look at a whole school approach to dealing with COVID to really have as a critical component parental engagement and support for parents. Finally, I want to say that in the long term, it will be important to invest in the availability and the coordination of social services to ensure, you know, students have a continuum of services to meet their continuum of needs, as well as to continue to build on the gains of the Child Friendly School Initiative, which really seeks to ensure that all children, regardless of their needs, are able to access quality education through things like student voice, parental engagement, positive discipline. And I want to highly suggest that we review our behavioral policies to ensure that positive discipline is promoted, as we recognize this is a trauma-informed way of discipline. And looking at how we teach, recognizing that teaching must go beyond the walls now of the classroom, but it must also go beyond the speak, learn dichotomy. And finally, I would say that the time has come to really critically see the investment in creating trauma-sensitive learning environments, not as an option, but as a critical need. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Lynch. Very, very informative, very interesting. I'm sure we'll get some questions relating to this in our question and answer session. Now we're going to come to Mr. Christopher Daring, who has a regional stature as a corporate leader. He's here in his capacity as an entrepreneur with his latest venture, Ready TV and ReadyNet. And we've heard a lot about provision of infrastructure, and he is pioneering Jamaica's first satellite-delivered internet service. Mr. Daring.
Thank you, and good morning to everybody. First, I'd like to say I really appreciate the opportunity. Everybody seems to have a strong bent on the educational aspect of it, which is very, very important. But certainly one of the things that we've seen, if I just share my screen, is the fact that, you know, what COVID-19 has done is to truly expose not just the underbelly of weaknesses or strengths in the educational scenario. But it's also exposed the underbelly of our infrastructure across the Caribbean and certainly here in Jamaica. Jamaica's communication infrastructure has been seen to be wanting, and it has been a little bit unfair on civil servants like Dr. McLean, where you hear the public virtually clamoring on the Ministry of Education to try and solve the infrastructure problems that people individually are facing, whether access to internet and so on. So it's very important to understand the limitations of that, and certainly the situation has exposed itself in terms of the economic divide, which has led to the digital divide. Now, in this digital world, we've also seen very strong or huge gap between rural and urban societies and their access to information and access to the digital world. And we've also seen the limitations of technology. So, you know, internet is just not internet. So some people might have intermittent internet connectivity. Some people have permanent internet connectivity. Some people have higher broadband speeds, which allows them to access audiovisual content relatively cheaply. Some people have only access to mobile internet on a 3G or even a 2G basis. So clearly, when you say access to internet, you have to divide between whether you actually have the Ferrari, which is the high-speed broadband, versus a Mercedes-Benz, which is another form of internet that may be at a lower speed. But one of the also in digital world has also meant that we're becoming more and more exposed to terminology and technology that most of the country has not been exposed to before. So for instance, when we built the first digital broadcast network, people didn't quite understand the difference between broadcast and internet and the cost benefits that accrues from digitally broadcasting audiovisual content versus the internet. In broadcast world, we know you put up a tower, you broadcast, and it doesn't matter whether one person has on their television set or a billion people have on their television set. The cost is virtually the same, and essentially all the consumers is consuming in terms of cost is their electricity bill. So there are certain universal truths that we now have to accept. One is that economics drives investment, and so there's a very good reason, a very logical reason why urban communities tend to get much more of the infrastructure investment than rural communities. Secondly, you know, all countries in the Caribbean, in particular Jamaica, because of its size and topography, you need a matrix of digital solutions. You cannot expect that everybody's going to get the same type of internet. You can't expect that everybody's going to be able to afford it. So there's socioeconomic factors that are going to determine what type of internet connectivity that they're going to receive. There's a technology choice, so that, you know, that's going to be determined by the types of technology people are comfortable with using. There's topography, so there's certainly some areas of Jamaica that are only accessible, or certainly you can only serve through different types of technology, such as satellite up in the mountains or fiber in urban communities. Then we also have to accept that there's going to be an incredible capacity demand over the next couple of years. Jamaica and the Caribbean are not alone in terms of infrastructure weaknesses being exposed. And you saw it across the globe as the demand for internet exploded because of the stay-at-home scenario. So we are going to be, as a country and as a region, in competition for that investment capital, that capex, that infrastructure capacity for the internet, with countries, with regions like Latin America, which are much larger, much more attractive, so to speak, from a socioeconomic perspective because of their size. And so we have to recognize it. And so regulatory environment has to strongly recognize that. I'll give you a good example is that in Jamaica, we don't distinguish from a spectrum cost, for instance, between rural and urban. So you can put up a broadcast tower in the middle of Kingston and you pay the same spectrum fee, and that broadcast tower might serve, you know, 500,000 people. And you put up a small gap filler in the mountains of, you know, Buff Bay Valley, serving maybe 50 people. And the Spectrum Management Authority will charge you the same amount of money for both towers. So it's almost a disincentive to invest in those rural communities. And these are kind of the underbelly that COVID-19 pandemic has sort of exposed and brought to the front, so that we know regulators are now looking seriously at that to try and incentivize investors and communication operators to invest in the rural communities, invest in those areas that are just intrinsically very challenging to invest in. So one of the things we set out to do by developing the e-homeschool network in conjunction with the Ministry of Education is that we recognized that we had to utilize all distribution platforms across the country. So it doesn't matter whether it's fiber to the home or digital broadcast on the Red TV network, or cable operators that are there, 4G LTE networks, microwave networks, Wi-Fi networks, and even our new satellite delivered internet network. Those are simply distribution platforms. And so we had to make sure that you have all distribution platforms being utilized for the delivery of the e-homeschool network, which is a series of 24/7 educational channels that are going to be broadcast, streamed, distributed across all of those networks, so that you're reaching, you know, virtually the affordability factor. So you have different types of access to those networks, whether it be a television set, whether it be a mobile phone, whether it be a tablet. It should not matter. You develop one set of content, educational content, that is then distributed across all platforms and then accessed by all types of instruments. So we always have to be dealing with affordability, availability, and access. Affordability, obviously, you have different socioeconomic groupings, and some people will be able to afford a 24/7 mobile data connectivity. Most people will not be able to. Some people have fixed internet in the home, will not be able to afford a monthly recurring bill to have fixed internet in the home. But some people have television. And I want to emphasize that, because when we talk about online, the E in e-learning actually stands for electronic. It doesn't stand for online. So you were really looking at all electronic forms of distribution. And there are lots of people that have television sets. You know, in Jamaica, out of the 880,000 households, 800,000 have a television set. And it's, of course, the most cost-effective way to distribute content. So we wanted to make sure that that was available. So our end game is, of course, to have that content, educational content, a whole series of educational channels, whether it be vocational training, whether it be primary school, which we've started with, on e-classes being delivered live and delayed with interactivity across all of those platforms. And just to demonstrate the sort of importance of that, you know, even this symposium is being broadcast live across the region, across Jamaica. It's being broadcast on cable, whether it be Flow or Digicel and Ready TV. It's being broadcast over the air on Ready TV. It's available on the internet and so on. So that just gives you an idea of what we're trying to achieve with the e-homeschool network. The content is important. It is being developed. They're both live and interactive classes. And when we also, distribute it by streaming over the internet, if you do have that network in your area, then that is what will be used to access it. So it's very important we understand that there's a plethora of classrooms that are being developed. Each different type of classroom develops different lessons, whether it's primary school, secondary school. We even have universities coming to us to take distribution channels to make sure that their students are going to be able to access those classes. The last thing I'd like to leave you with is that we need a whole regulatory approach. There are governments that are sitting on spectrum that they believe has a certain amount of value. But the truth is that the days when you expect major operators to come into the Caribbean, pay a lot of money for spectrum and build out infrastructure and try and recuperate that investment from post-COVID economies, those days are probably over for now. And we've seen examples in other countries where they're being very proactive to attract that capital. New Zealand, for instance, have just allocated that spectrum to operators and told them to build those networks, and they're penalized if they don't build the networks to serve the population. So we think here in the Caribbean, we have to be extra aggressive, in my view, to attract that investment that's needed to put internet in every school. I can tell you with our satellite service, that satellite that has been put up was not put up in circulating Earth to serve the Caribbean. It was launched to serve Latin America. We just happened to fall in that shadow, and so we can access some of that capacity. But if that capacity is going to be utilized in Latin America, the Caribbean is going to get left behind. And therefore, we need to do whatever is necessary to make sure that capacity stays within the Caribbean. We get our fair share of that capacity. And that is by having a very proactive regulatory environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Daring. And now, Dr. Wayne Wesley, who is the Registrar and Chief Executive Officer of the Caribbean Examinations Council, his presentation will be done by a video that he has prepared, and then we can have him for question and answers. I'm going to ask Dr. Thompson immediately after Dr. Wesley's presentation to take over the question and answer section of this panel discussion. Thank you.
Good day, colleagues. Let me start by congratulating the Caribbean Center for Educational Planning for the vision to host this important webinar. The Caribbean Examinations Council is pleased to contribute to this regional discourse geared towards fostering the development of resilient education systems in the Caribbean. The Caribbean Examinations Council, an institution of CARICOM under the auspices of the Council for Human and Social Development Education, was established in 1972 under the agreement of 16 participating governments. The Council is empowered to conduct such examinations as deemed appropriate and award certificates and diplomas for such examinations. The transformation imperatives facing us as a region due to the challenges posed by COVID-19 include disruption to education process, system readiness, technological capacity. This has led to the imperatives: resilience, digital transformation, and educational imperatives, requiring policy formulation to include data, teacher education, and the delivery system, to support the education system with the right leadership, delivery mechanism, and infrastructure support. The resilience imperative. The critical challenge now facing regional economies is one of resilience. Sustaining meaningful economic activities during periods of natural disasters or health pandemic. An ability to mitigate the impact of these existential threats on developing economies for the region remains a top priority. The education system is one of the most critical activities of any economy, and this is so because it develops the most valuable asset of any country, its human capital. Therefore, crucial to the building of resilience to continue and sustain critical economic activities for development and growth requires an infrastructure revolution, the core of which is digital transformation. Digital transformation is not only vital, but crucial in fostering resilience. It is within this resilient environment that the critical function of developing the human capital through the teaching, learning, and assessment process will continue without disruption. Digital transformation is another imperative. Therese Turner-Jones, General Manager, IDB, gave the region a rating of 5 out of 10 with regards to readiness. She stated, and I quote, "We are not nearly as ready as we should be. We have mobile devices, millions in the region. However, we do not have as much digital use regarding services, government and private." End of quote. Thirdly, the education imperatives must be buttressed by digital transformation for access to be universal and inclusive, equity to be fair, quality to be standardized, and relevance to be applicable, thus creating a resilient environment. This transformation agenda is not without challenges, in particular, the infrastructure challenge to deal with internet penetration and the infrastructure cost. To support education imperatives, the delivery mechanism requires a digital infrastructure so that teaching, learning, and assessment would be supported by digital transformation so that teaching will provide designed experiences, simulations, and digitization of learning resources for online consumption to aid learning. Assessment that will see the utilization of performance reports through data portals with descriptive and predictive analytics to inform teaching. The deployment of e-testing systems in schools to provide familiarity and preparation for both teachers and students. The validation of outcomes in certifying competence and digital credentialing as an authentic representation of certification. CHC has embarked on an e-strategy encompassing 1, the e-learning hub, which allows for the provision of a single collaborative and engaging space online to access digital and other resources to support teaching, learning, and assessment. 2, e-testing, which allows for automation of the test development cycle and the online delivery of tests. 3, e-marking, which allows for digitization of the marking process and improved quality control and monitoring capabilities. E-certification, which allows for dissemination of digital credentials. This transformation requires a robust policy infrastructure to support the educational imperatives of access, equity, quality, and relevance, with policies such as instructional policies, learning policies, assessment policies, and digital policies. In addition, critical support systems are needed to include psychosocial support systems, technological support systems, infrastructure support systems, and technical resource support system. Accordingly, what is required is the reorientation of our leadership mindset, nationally and regionally, to the 21st century imperative for digital transformation as a key resilience strategy for the region. The future of work is constantly redefining the construct of economic activities, requiring an agile education system to respond effectively. Galvanizing crucial government, private sector, and development partner support in committing the requisite resources, financial, regulatory, and technical, towards building a resilient regional education system for greater inclusivity and sustainability. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, and may God bless you.
To the members of the panel and to my co-moderator, Mrs. Henry Wilson, We have received several questions from our viewers online. I'll do my best to summarize the issues and to present the questions to the various panelists. Let's start with the Minister of Education, Dr. Grace McLean. There are two questions that have been raised. One having to do with the results of the assessment that were done in the first 3 weeks, whether there are intentions or plans to make adjustments to the curriculum given what we have been learning during this situation, during this pandemic. And connecting those two as one question, the other question is, what are the plans? You've mentioned intentions to utilize space in terms of temporary holding areas like tents. What are the medium to long-term plans for retrofitting the infrastructure of our schools?
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Thompson. In response to the first question, just to clarify, the 3 weeks of assessment will take place from September 7th and onward. And we are developing structured assessment instruments that will be administered at all levels from early childhood to the end of secondary. It is our intention to work with our teachers to identify the gaps, and the ministry has perfected that art as it relates to assessment, so we have the framework to get that done. Following this review of the assessment, down to perhaps even the subtasks, then we will now have discussion with our curriculum officers to review the curriculum, our national standard curriculum, which we introduced about 3-4 years ago. And we will move towards making adjustments to the curriculum if it is necessary. We will also consider the addition of let's say an hour or so to the school day if our administrators are in agreement, and in some cases there may be a narrowing of the holiday period again if our administrators are in agreement. So effectively there are some localized decisions that will be made regarding the completion of the curriculum. Based on how the national standards curriculum is set up, which is really a progressive or that is used right through to grade 9. Whatever would have been adjusted for for the new school year coming up, the students will be able to catch up in subsequent years. We will, however, pay special attention to those students from grade 6 who will be moving into grade 7, and special attention to those students from grade 9 who will be moving into grade 10. So we are expecting that there will be some adjustments based on the review and the necessary interventions accordingly. Dr. Thompson, we are in the process of putting in place a national sector committee to look at the medium to long-term plans for education from a strategic perspective. We are currently advancing our proposal to Cabinet for their approval. Once they have approved, then the public will be made aware, and we are expecting that team to be able now to take us forward in terms of the medium-term and long-term plans. So importantly, just to indicate that the plans that we are making now really are to facilitate the opening in September.
Thank you very much, Dr. McLean. I want to turn the next question to Mrs. Lynch. A number of persons have indicated their support for the notion that psychosocial support is going to be critical for our students and our teachers. One question is, how do we integrate social and emotional wellness alongside and in the curriculum to ensure that our students and our teachers are able to deal more resolutely and effectively with challenges of this kind?
Thank you, Dr. Thompson, and thank you for that question. There are several ways we can do this. I think at this time, one of the most immediate ways we can look to do that is through how we seek to ensure that our classrooms are healing classrooms. And when I say that, the kinds of relationships we're building. So we know that the physical classroom may look very different, But as we seek to really help with psychosocial, however that classroom looks, building that relationship between the adults that are there and the students are there, whether that is virtually or just physically, that is going to be important aspect of helping children to feel safe and a sense of predictability, which we know is crucial for emotional well-being, especially on the heels of a trauma. The next thing that may be helpful, which is not a direct way, but an indirect way of doing this, is ensuring that as we do our lessons, we provide opportunities for students to express themselves. So this may mean that as we are doing English, we look at topics that have to do about how are we feeling about this? How did the character feel? What happened? What might you feel? Have you had experiences like this where you felt that? What was helpful? And really drawing on what we have within our region, which is a rich history in storytelling. I think storytelling is one of the powerful means of healing. So we're looking at building a healing classroom, providing opportunities, and not just storytelling, but the arts. So using the arts to heal, and that can be done in any subject area that our students are in right now. And also partnering with parents. I think we really have to strengthen our resolve to reach even those parents who seem unreachable, and harness the power now of technology and the media to do so. Because I think many students will be returning with issues that we may not even be able to fathom yet. And in order to address them, we will need their caregivers on board, also knowing what they need to do at home. So I would say those would be some ways to begin. And also just then the intentional integration, teaching teachers, how do you integrate social and emotional learning within your curriculum? So having training sessions, webinars, perhaps over the summer, beginning to prepare teachers to look at how these skills, resilience, hope, compassion can be integrated, communication can be integrated in their various curriculum.
I want to turn quickly to Mr. Darin and ask if you could say a little bit more about the timeline for the rollout of the additional services to provide the infrastructure support to allow for more effective online delivery.
Sure. So we've actually launched the eHomeschool network, and in fact, this entire forum is being broadcast live on that channel, as I said, across all multiple platforms. So it's also on on other networks such as Flow, such as Digicel, etc. And I think that's an important thing to understand. We don't believe that any single company or any single technology can solve all the issues of connectivity in the country, and therefore you need to utilize all platforms that are available. Secondly, we're rolling out the satellite internet, which is imminent. We've already done 3 schools, and you have to also understand that satellite is best suited for those locations where other technologies can't reach, and that's available now. We have equipment along the way, so we should have another 100 schools rolled out within another month. You can do probably 5 or 6 schools a day, and that's one of the advantages of satellite, because you're getting your internet connectivity from a satellite 22,000 miles away. Everywhere is connected. All you need is the satellite dish and the modem to connect it. So it's an immediate access, which is tremendous. Now, as Dr. McLean will tell you, internet is not inexpensive. It is the Ferrari of connectivity. And if we believe that we're going to be able to give every community, every student in Jamaica and the Caribbean a Ferrari, then I think that's a pipe dream. And so what you have to do is to build an infrastructure that caters to all types of socioeconomic conditions, all types of topographies, etc. So, which is why television is extremely important, digital television in particular, where you can broadcast multiple channels, you can have interactivity on digital broadcast channels, and every home virtually has a television set. One television set can even serve an entire, we call them tenement yards here in Jamaica. It serves a community in a sense, a family. So you cannot just only talk about primary and secondary and university education, but you can talk about vocational training. So we should have a vocational training television channels being broadcast live into people's homes. And that is what the digital revolution is all about. Every digital type of instrument can access any digital network. So it doesn't matter whether you have a television set, you can surf the internet. They're smart TVs. But if you don't have the internet, you can then surf broadcast networks. And so that is how you have to approach the solution. And every country around the world is doing it similarly. In Africa, there are massive digital broadcast networks that are being used for educational content. So we have a digital broadcast network that is rolled out here in Jamaica. Those channels are now accessible by everybody across the island, whether it be on their own cable network or on the Ready TV broadcast network.
Thank you very much. I must apologize to our other two presenters. Our time is running, and so I'm going to be handing over now to Dr. Chantal Moore to take us through the final processes of this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thompson. Good day. I am one of the members of the CCEP operations team, and I have the responsibility and the pleasure of summarizing the lessons and insights from today's webinar, and to also say thank you and to wrap up a wonderful morning spent. So in terms of the lessons, the importance of adaptation and resilience for the transformation and sustainability of quality education to make it accessible to all. That's key. Secondly, collaboration and mobilization are essential to build back and or strengthen our work in education. And this is happening via myriad forms, and we see it happening in online, blended, community notice boards, couriering of lessons, and so on. And a third lesson for us has to do with the technological and educational gaps, which are now visible to more of us, and some gaps have widened because of the socioeconomic and other access issues. And we see how it is impacting gender and our children in particular. And therefore, these are pointing to changes that are needed at the national and regional levels, and the change has to focus more on creativity, lifelong learning, 21st century skills acquisition, technological access, and so on. And the final lesson this morning has to do with the psychosocial and emotional issues that are real and which need to be addressed in order to make our learners at all levels of the education system feel more secure and be more ready for learning to take place in classrooms. Coming out of the lessons, we want to highlight some of the insights. Quite a number of insights, but I will just zero in on possibly 3 of them. The first one, which Professor Weber spoke to, is the whole business of the difference between online and emergency remote teaching and learning. We should try not to confuse the two because they have implications for how we go further and forward with education. We want to make sure that when learners hear the word online, they're not thinking that it is equivalent to what happened during the emergency remote moment occasioned by COVID. Secondly, educational planning is key. COVID-19 caught some teachers and institutions quite flat-footed, unprepared for the pandemic. But we quickly responded, and we are recovering because of the lessons we learned personally, as well as what we learned from each other in professional spaces and webinars such as these. Now, a key insight that we mustn't undervalue or forget is the whole business of how teachers are showing great commitment to teaching. They're connecting classroom instruction and their care for their students. They're connecting all of this to parents. They're connecting it to the wider community, to the ministers and ministries of education, and beyond, to other stakeholders who have an interest in the business and the process of education. So parents, I'm sure, can attest that teachers are, in fact, to be valued. Now, how do we respond to the lessons and the insights that we have learned? One, pandemics are real, and they can surface at any time. COVID taught us that. Just in a swift moment, it came at us, and there are others that are likely to come in the future. Natural disasters are also and always looming. So how do we, within the Caribbean, plan for and build a resilient education system for our students? Let's look at some of our responses that were put forward by the panelists and our keynote speaker. One, we have to leverage resources to regain learning losses and to minimize inequities. A second response is to forge partnerships to facilitate training and the sharing of expert and expertise locally and regionally. Thirdly, we have to strive to equalize the quality of education across schools at all levels. And finally, as a response, the gathering of data. Look at the facts, look at the information as they surface, because the data, the facts, the information are going to be quite useful in shaping school developmental plans so that they are contextually relevant, they are flexible, and they are resilient. So coming out of the webinar for today, facilitated by the Caribbean Center for Educational Planning, we want to say that we are learning from COVID, all of us who participated in this. We recognize the imperatives. We are, in fact, grasping the opportunities, and we are seeking to build resilient education systems within the Caribbean. The webinar has been, to my estimation, very informative, robust, comprehensive, interesting, and timely. And because of the richness of this webinar, there are quite a number of individuals we have to say thank you to because of the work that they put into making it happen today. I want to thank the head of the CCEP, Dr. Keynote Thompson, and the steering committee members. We want to thank, too, our principal at the University of the West Indies Mona campus, Professor Dale Weber, and also the program specialist at UNESCO, Dr. Farrell Khan. The keynote speaker, Miss Cynthia Hobbs, we say a special thank you for sharing with us those highlights today. And for Ms. Montgomery, the CCEP administrator who introduced her, as well as Dr. Charlene Cole, who fielded the questions and answers, we thank you very much. We cannot forget nor fail to mention the panelists on both panels. The first panel, we had Mr. Owen Speed, Mr. Julian Monrose, Dr. Hyacinth Harris, Dr. Zoe Kincaid-Clark, and Mrs. Thatcher Luton, who spoke to the issue of experiences of teachers, students, and school management, and the moderators were Dr. Therese Ferguson and Dr. Verna Knight. For panel 2, we had Mr. Rafa Gordon, Ms. Dr. Grace McLean, Mrs. Nicole Lynch, Mr. Christopher Derrin, and Dr. Wayne Wesley, speaking to educational policy and support systems for greater inclusivity and sustainability. And most important, ladies and gentlemen, we cannot omit all the members of the audience who logged in and stayed with us longer than we had anticipated, but we couldn't log off earlier because the information was so necessary. Right, so over 900 persons logged in and joined us today. And we just want to say thank you very much, a resounding applause to each of you who joined us and participated, and gave us the questions and all of those. Thank you very much. And we just want to invite Dr. Thompson to come now and tell us one last thing.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Moore. Thank you very much, Dr. Moore. Thanks again to everyone who joined us. It has been a very meaningful experience. We look forward to your comments. The presentation will be kept up on YouTube, so you can tell your friends and your professional colleagues and neighbors that they can go on and review the webinar. You who sat through it, you can go back and have access to it. I want to thank our friends, our hard-working professional colleagues here at the Mona Information and Technology Service here at Mona Campus for their superb work and support. They have made it possible for us to reach you. I want to thank Mr. Chris Daring for the initiative of making this webinar available on Flow, Digicel, and Ready TV. And you'll also be able to see it at your convenience when it is replayed on Mona TV. Thank you all. God bless.